Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Relationship Blueprint, where you unlock your power of connection. And we have been really having a series of our podcasts are all around recovery from sexual abuse, recovering from ourselves, from our childhood belief system that we no longer need. We're really today talking about something that's very close to my heart, which is recovery from drugs and alcohol. And I have someone with me that I respect greatly. Her story is powerful, and I admire her so much. It's unique to find a woman who is so dedicated to her recovery and helping others and being willing to share the story because the stigma is still out there about drugs and alcohol and Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step recovery programs. And I just love that she's willing to invite us into that world and help us understand her journey. So I would like to introduce Suzanna. And
Of
hi,
Hi,
thanks for being with us today.
course.
Yeah. So I met Susanna through her mom. I had adopted a dog from another breeder, and that dog died within 6 days, a little puppy. She had a brain tumor, and I was devastated. And I wrote to about 30 different breeders telling my story, the whole story, which I won't get into right now, but it was painful. And I said, I just want a healthy dog. I want a healthy dog that I can train to be a therapy dog and to just have a sweet disposition. And so, of all the people, a lot of people wrote me back. They really did. And they were very encouraging and said what happened was one in a million. But really, your mom, Beth, was the one who wrote to me and spoke to my heart. She's a really good woman, and she FaceTimed with us, and we got to see other puppies that were there because our Tilly hadn't been born yet. And we saw her in her home with the beautiful little puppies in their playpen. And I thought, yeah, this feels right. This feels right. So, our Matilda, whom we call Tilly, and who's being trained as a therapy dog right now, is the light of our lives. We just love her. And I'll never forget Beth and your mom's help with all of that. And so I'm forever grateful.
So I believe that you confided in my mom that you were in recovery, and because my mom is a legendary oversharer, I'm sure she told you not only that I'm also in recovery, but that I was also really struggling at the time, and I needed some guidance in both the form of therapy, but also from someone who had struggled with substance abuse and who did understand the place I was at. And I'm surprised I remember this, but I do remember her telling me that she had met someone through the puppies, you, obviously, who was a therapist locally. And I remember being pretty more than pretty willing right off the bat to meet with you because I mean the place I was at in my life was I was very tired of I was just over it. Everything I'd put myself through, the place I'd gotten myself to, I didn't know how to get out of it, but I knew that I was over it and I was really willing to try anything. And so I'm sure I made it as difficult as possible to get in contact with me, and I'm sure I was a little bit flaky there in the beginning, but overall, I remember really being excited to talk to a mental health professional who understood because after being in and out of treatment centers, I had, for the most part, really only experienced therapy in a substance abuse recovery setting with therapists who were not in recovery. And it felt really frustrating. I mean, for obvious reasons, but I knew I needed to be in therapy, but also I was recognizing how it would be a lot more helpful if the person offering me the therapy had been there, because is you can read all the textbooks in the world, but I could just always still pick up on that, the one crucial thing that the experience that you have that they were lacking, which was that they just, as much as they were educated on substance abuse, it's like they still couldn't understand why I just kept going back to it. Like it was almost like they were asking me why I kept going back to it in a way that was supposed to be framed as if they're helping me try to understand myself, but it very much felt like it was them trying to understand me. And
Mm,
I just knew that it would be so much easier to connect with a therapist who knew that there is no why. I can't give you a good answer for why I keep going back because it's fun. Like, no, it's not fucking, do I look like I'm having fun? It's not fun. It's not having a good time. It's not a party. It's not anything other than a mental illness. And it just, as helpful as AA and NA and other recovery groups were, and as helpful as it was being in group settings with other people in recovery, when it came, because one-on-one therapy is something I've worked in or been involved with since I was, I believe, 5 years old, for mostly family related issues. And then when substance abuse became my biggest issue, it just kind of felt like there was this disconnect between me and my therapists in a way there never had been before.
mm, mm.
And so finding a therapist who had been there specifically with my same drug of choice, one that's so normalized and so popular, and especially for someone my age, it was really encouraging. And definitely right off the bat, I felt like it was going to be much more helpful to me than trying to get help from someone who was simultaneously trying to understand my choices that I didn't even understand.
Yeah. And it didn't feel much like your job to understand them or to convince them of what was really going on when you couldn't explain it in words. You, as you said, you were sick and suffering and you were over it, but you couldn't find a way to stay sober. And that pain is something that people don't understand, the shame involved, the disappointment, the feeling of hurting your family and the friends that you love. Like there's there's no other experience quite like that. And you were absolutely willing, but our story together has been lots of twists and turns in your sobriety. It wasn't like a straight line. Could you help our listeners understand your story? Every story is unique, and yet we're all the same. We're all struggling with this idea of how do I stay sober? It's the only coping skill I have, at least for me. I couldn't imagine living life without my coping skill. I wanted to manage it. I wanted to drink less, but I didn't really want to give it up. And that was the push pull for me. So I want to hear about your story.
So when I tell my story to people who are early in recovery, I kind of highlight the ways I feel like I'm similar to the classic addict who's entering recovery for the first time, and then I highlight the ways where it was kind of different. And like I mentioned earlier, it's it's a much different experience having your drug of choice be something that is everywhere. It's not like I by chance stumbled upon alcohol. I went to college in Charleston, South Carolina, and it, I struggle to think of a single person I was friends with there who wasn't actively drinking on a weekly basis, if not more often. And so going back to when I was 14 years old, when I drank for the first time, well, I remember the first part of the night so clearly, and that was that my friend and I were having a sleepover, and we were going to each take a beer from my parent. There was enough in the fridge where it seemed like us each taking one wouldn't be very noticeable, and that was our plan for the night. And all I remember after that is she drank her beer, she went to bed, I drank my beer, and then raided the liquor cabinet and blacked out. So
Wow.
right off the bat, I made it pretty obvious that I wasn't going to be very normal about using substances. And of course, for a really long time, I kind of chalked that up to the fact that I was 14 years old. 14-year-olds don't know how to drink. 14-year-olds don't know what their limit is, especially if it's their first time drinking. And that was my excuse for a long time. And obviously, knowing everything that I know now, I look back and it's kind of the opposite now. That was not at all normal. Yes, it's true. 14-year-olds don't know their limit. They don't know how to properly drink. But now that I know what I know, and now that I've seen everything that's happened in my life because of alcohol, it's much more obvious that that was never going to be I could have been 40 years old when I decided to drink that first beer, and it would have most likely turned out the same way.
Mm.
And so my moving on to when I turned 21 and alcohol became a regular part of my life, it was never from the get-go, it was never normal. Every time I drank to black out. That was just a given. And then I remember, and I'm sure it's partially kind of I don't want to say falsified memory because I know it happened, but I'm sure I've kind of put pieces together that I don't truly remember clearly. But when I was 22 years old, I had my life, it felt at the time a lot worse than it actually was. I had broken my arm and I was out of work from a job that I loved. I was not doing well at school and I had gone through a really traumatic breakup the day before. First of all, that's kind of a recipe for disaster with an addict, being paid not to work, being paid to stay at home and have no accountability. And regular income is, I didn't know it at the time, but again, of course, looking back now, I realize how dangerous that was for me. And I remember the morning after that breakup, I was on the phone with my manager at work talking about when I was going to go back. And in that moment, I truly felt like there was just no way I was going to be able to ever go in public ever again. I wasn't going to class. I had lost my person. And the idea of going back to work where everybody
Mm.
was so familiar with me and my ex, I would have rather crawled in a hole and died. And I was in my backyard and I was violently hungover. And I kind of had this like, I really don't want to call it a light bulb moment because that makes it sound like it was a good idea, but I don't know what else to call it, where I just kind of realized like I don't have to be hungover and I also don't have to be sober if I just never stop drinking. Like, who says I have to wait until, like, that's just some societal standard. I don't have to wait until the after. I can just start drinking right now. And it was 9 o'clock in the morning. And I went into the kitchen and got some beer and I started drinking that morning. And I didn't stop for a little over a year. And when it all finally came crashing down, my number one excuse to keep drinking was that anybody in my situation would have gotten a little out of control with the substance abuse. And I just needed a second to process what had happened, get my head screwed back on straight again, and then we could go back to normal drinking. What I was not taking into account for was that there was no going back to normal drinking because it never had been normal drinking.
Mm.
It had been after 5 o'clock most of the time drinking, but still by no means was it normal drinking. And so my entire first month of treatment, that was my mindset was I'm gonna get things straightened out in my head, and then I'll like everyone else here is clearly really committed to the lifetime of sobriety thing. I'm here to sort out my thoughts and feelings and emotions so that when I leave here, I can consume alcohol like a normal person, forgetting that I had never once in my entire life consumed alcohol like a normal person. Um,
Can I interrupt for just a second, Susanna? Because I think what I'm curious about as I'm hearing the chronology of your story is this breakup was the trauma that really kicked it off. Would that be accurate to say? That although you started, at 14, you didn't drink like every other 14-year-old might throw up and say, I'll never do that again until they're 18, and then they, you know, but
right.
for you, it was right then when you would drink to black out, and then once you're in Charleston, all bets are off and you're full on. But the breakup, it sounds like that was pretty traumatic.
It was.
Yeah.
It Yeah, it was kind of one of those situations where I had always thought for a long time, I was with this person for 4 years, and I had kind of, as someone with an anxious attachment style, had worried about the potential of a breakup for a long time. And I kind of thought, um, if I lost this person, it would be the worst thing that ever happened to me. And what I did not realize was that this person, not only was I going to lose her, but she was going to make it so much worse than any. It wasn't just a, it wasn't just her leaving me. She betrayed me in a pretty spectacular way. And so I think when I had for so long worried, like, what will I do if this person breaks up with me? And then not only did a breakup happen, but I found out things that I never could have imagined. My brain just kind of like shorted out in a way. Like
Of course.
I couldn't handle all of the information that came at me at once. And something that I do make very clear when I tell my story is I my alcoholism that spiraled into 24/7, 365 drinking, that was going to happen regardless of this person could have never existed in my life. This person and I could still be together today, but it was always going to turn into what it turned into
Mhm.
because I have the alcoholic brain. That series of events just happened to be what triggered my first round of what I consider active addiction.
Yeah. Well, and then were talking about recovery and how you went into treatment, but your mind was like, this will be a good time to reset. I'll be able to drink normally. I'll kind of get myself cleaned up. How did you end up in treatment the first time? What got you there?
So after that constant drinking started, my friends and family kind of one by one started figuring out that something was seriously wrong. Um, I believe my dad was the first one to pick up on the fact that he had no idea what was going on. I think he really hoped it wasn't drugs or alcohol, but he could sense that something was wrong. And then my friends would not only see my behavior, but just see me physically in person. And I think because once I realized myself that it was a problem, I was very careful to, as much as possible, because we all know we never really truly hide it. It's not, unless you don't interact with a single human being ever, there is no hiding it. I did what I thought was a pretty good job of hiding it, but of course, one by one, people started figuring out that something was really wrong. And once my mom had to take me to the hospital for alcohol poisoning, and I did my absolute best to convince her that it was a complete accident, that that this was not a regular thing. We were on vacation. I just, things got out of control, and that I had no idea how it happened, and it was something that would never happen again. I probably was like, I'll be much more careful with my drinking. Like I was so desperate to convince her that because she kept bringing up the word rehab after that happened, and I was so desperate to convince her that everything was fine because I knew I knew enough about recovery and AA and sobriety to know that the second I admitted that there was a problem, regardless of what I thought about myself, even though it was completely backwards, I knew that the second I admitted to anyone that there was a problem with alcohol, it was over. There would be no admitting I have a problem with alcohol and then ordering a drink out at dinner or going to a party or in any way being able to have alcohol in my life after that. So I dug my claws into the fact that it did not matter who was confronting me, how hard they were confronting me, what evidence they had. I just knew that at the end of the day, there was no way I could admit that there was a problem because there'd be no going back. You can't say I was kidding or I was wrong. Like I was just, I'm sure I looked hysterical. I can't think of a better word than hysterical, trying to convince her that this was a complete accident and that I did not have a problem with alcohol and that I did not need treatment and that this would never happen again. And so once she had that experience in the forefront of her mind and she found out that I got fired from the job I had, so at the time it would have been 6 years. She found out I got fired from that job, and there was no convincing her that I was okay. She drove to Charleston when she found that out, and she said, "You're calling your dad and you're telling him that you're going to rehab." And I'm sure for a few minutes I tried to be like, "No, I'm not." And when your mother's sitting there with the look on her face that I'm sure she had on, I don't even think that I could have continued to. I knew it was over. I knew. Um, yeah, there was no getting out of what I had gotten myself into. I had found out that alcohol withdrawal existed the hard way. I think that's kind of another classic event for addicts is finding out not only that physical dependency and withdrawal is a thing, but at some point trying to quit their substance and finding out the hard way that A, it exists, and B, they're going through it. And so I realized that I was going to have to either detox at the hospital or drink throughout the workday. And neither seemed like a good option, but I knew that I was definitely not going to a hospital to detox. So I'd been drinking at work, and I believe that my manager did me a favor by firing me and only mentioning the specific things I had messed up at work and not fired me by putting in my paperwork that I had been drinking because of course she knew. Like there's no way she didn't, but when she fired me, she did keep it to the the very specifics of what I had done wrong and what I had messed up and what I had forgotten to do, which was a lot.
Susanna, when I think people that don't have issues hear these stories that you and I have heard and experienced, I think they think, well, if you got fired from your job of 6 years and your mom's so worried about you, like for them, it's a logical conclusion that like, why don't you just stop? You have family that will take you to rehab. What can you say to those people about what keeps us from what keeps us from accepting the help we so desperately need?
I remember that day that I got fired, I had caused a lot of problems during the last shift I ever worked. And the day that I got fired, a guy I was dating at the time actually drove me to work. And I was lucid enough to know how bad that last shift had been. And literally, I was so drunk that I thought it was funny that I was like, I need you to drive me to work. And I also need you to just hang tight in the parking lot because I'm not going to be in there for very long. Like, I didn't bring my work bag. I didn't bring any of my work stuff. I was like, I need you to drive me to work to get fired. Um, because the least I could do after everything, after how supportive my manager had been, and after everything I had put her through, the least I could do was let her fire me to my face instead of just texting her and being like, I know it's over. Sorry, I
Wow.
guess.
Wow.
So I had him drive me to work. I had him wait in the parking lot, and I went in and I got fired. And I can laugh about this now because I am not this person anymore, and I am not existing with this constant headspace anymore. But I remember just really being ready to get out of there as fast as possible so I could go home and drink. I remember, I hate to, it's not funny at all, but like I have to laugh. I remember being so thrilled that I didn't have to work an 8 hour shift that day, that I got cut loose early because even though I was drinking at work, I obviously was still not drinking the way I wanted to be. I was drinking at work to maintain so that I didn't have a seizure in the Starbucks I was working in, but I was not drinking the way I wanted to be drinking. And I I laugh about it now because it's so unbelievable that I was that far gone at a point in my life where I this job I'd once been so dedicated to, I showed up to just ready to get being fired over with so I could go home and drink. And I think goes to show how, like you were asking about, like if you're losing your job and if your family's so worried, why do you keep drinking? And at that point, it's because it really was all I knew. The worst feeling in the world to me at that time was starting to sober up. I always hated falling asleep because when I woke up, I was significantly more sober than I was when I passed out.
Mm.
And so at that time when I lost my job, I my brain was so it was just entirely wired to be thinking about drinking all the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And if I lost my job because of drinking, that just meant more time to drink. If my family was this worried about me drinking, that meant I needed to hide it better. There was no possible wake up call for me. Any potential roadblock that came up regarding my drinking, I would reframe to if these friends are telling me they're going to cut me off if I don't stop drinking, then I'm just going to stop letting them know I drink. There was no, oh my God, this is a wake up call. I'm going to stop drinking. It would be, how am I going to drink differently to make these two things work at the same time?
Hmm.
If my mom says that me continuing to drink means my parents are going to send me to rehab, then they just won't know that then I just can't tell them I'm drinking. Not, holy shit, my family is trying to shit me off to rehab. I should probably, I should probably go. If everyone thinks I need to go, it was, how am I going to change my behavior to quiet this situation and still be able to drink at the same time? Because it felt like that it realistically hadn't even been that long, but in my own head, it felt like that had been my reality for so long that I couldn't even comprehend changing.
I
I
think
couldn't
too, I don't know if this is true for you, but I just as I'm hearing your story, it's such a common theme when you're able to talk to other people that have suffered from addictions. It's almost like you can't imagine what your life would look like without it. So there's this protection of the disease, that exactly what you said to like, I don't know how I'll cope without it. So instead of going to rehab, I'll not spend time with family. I'll hide it better. I'll only drink on Fridays. I'll only drink beer. I'll only, the onlys. And what you're describing is so typical. And that people
and
say
we
addicts are liars, right? But so Susanna, we were talking about, this complex disease where we are convinced ourselves that we don't have a disease. The denial part is such a big part of the story because it's always like a bargaining, like this will be better this time, and I won't do it today, and I won't do it in front of my mom, and I won't drink before I see dad, or whatever the situation is. It's like a complete mind I won't say the word, but I think everyone can hear what I'm implying. It is just in our heads, and that's because the substance has control. The person no longer has control. So if you're wondering, our listeners, like, why doesn't you do this? It doesn't make sense to me. Of course it doesn't make sense to you because you've never had this take
Right.
over your brain. However, if you've ever ruminated, if anybody out there listening has ever like had a breakup and you keep thinking about the fights you had and you can't really let it go and you can't fall asleep and you wake up thinking about it, that's the best comparison that I can give to help people understand that it feels like you have no control over your own mind. And people who say, well, just stop. I challenge everybody out there when you're anxious and somebody says, just stop. It's going to be fine. What are you worried about? It's similar to that, only on a much bigger scale, because it really is by the time that it has control over a person, they are too deep into it to have really rational thoughts. There are moments of rational thoughts, but it's really taken over. And even if you're not, I was not physically addicted, but I was so psychologically addicted. It had me. That's all I can say. Mine was also triggered by a trauma, the death of my grandmother. So I had a late onset in life. I was about 46. And not that I drank normally. I don't know. I don't think so now. But I think by a lot of people's standards, those women out there who are saying, oh, I just have a few glasses of wine every night and then have one with dinner, and then maybe have one after. I think that we normalize drinking in a way that people don't realize. And if you're curious, go Google DSM-5 and look up substance use disorder with alcohol, and you might be surprised what you find out about yourself. But getting back to you, Susanna, you get out of the treatment after that first time and give us a feeling of what's the chronology? Because now you're 21 and you've
Mhm.
been in treatment once,
22. I believe I was 22.
22. So then what happens after that? Because it kind of speeds up after that, doesn't it?
I, again, this is nothing about this is truly funny. When I look back on how out of whack my mindset was, I just have to laugh. I did know I had no intentions of staying sober, but I did know that if I was going to let alcohol back into my life at all, but especially in a public way, I was going to have to be chill about it. It was not going to look good if I got out of rehab and was drinking that same night. I waited. I made some good points during that time. I was right about that. I believe I waited about a week. And then something you hear a lot in specifically AA that I now relate to so heavily is when people who were not one chip wonders, who went out and came back a lot, when they tried to reintroduce alcohol into their life, they'll tell you what the circumstances were, what the environment was, how much they drank, and then they'll say, and then the worst thing happened, which was nothing.
Uh-huh.
And I relate to that so much, especially in regards to the first time I drank after the first round of treatment. It was October and I was dating someone at the time and we went to his friend's house and she had made, I don't remember, it was some sort of seasonal warm drink. I believe it was apple cider or something. And she asked if I wanted whiskey in mine, which obviously I did. And so I said yes. And I had maybe one or two apple ciders with like such a small amount of whiskey that like it was barely even noticeable. And then nothing bad happened. It was an episode of what I imagined normal drinking was. I consumed alcohol. I didn't get drunk. I didn't leave that function and go buy alcohol and drink it by myself. Like I just, someone gave me a small amount of alcohol and I drank it and then I went home and went to sleep and everything was fine. And so that was that was the absolute worst thing that ever could have happened because that month that I had spent trying to convince myself that I could drink normally and that I could have a regular relationship with alcohol was I was already dead set on believing that. And then this one night happens. And if it wasn't already solidified in my brain that I was going to make drinking work, that completely did the trick.
Mm-hmm.
And so nothing happened. It was fine. And I was like, all right, the last month I've spent plotting has been confirmed. Of course, the very next day, the drinking completely took off in the same way all over again. I was back in treatment, I believe, 3 weeks later.
And when you say back in treatment, you didn't like walk into treatment, right? It usually ended up where you were in the hospital detoxing. Is that correct?
I would, what I would do, and I did this, I don't have an exact number, but it was more times than I can count. I would get so drunk that I would start panicking and I would want it to be over. I would want to be out of the cycle. I would start sobering up. I would go to the ER because I was clearly both feeling and exhibiting signs of alcohol withdrawal. And they would admit me for an alcohol detox. And then the second I would become sober enough to really understand the gravity of what was happening, I would leave.
Mm.
Well, it was a two-parter. I would become sober enough to really understand what I had done. And also, I would be sober enough for them to let me leave because I did find out the hard way multiple times that they will not let you leave the hospital if you're over the legal limit. And so that was a awful cycle I got into of relapsing, panicking, going to the hospital, asking for help, and then sobering up and realizing maybe I need help, maybe I don't. I don't care. I cannot feel this right now. And leaving and going back to drinking.
And when you say I can't feel this right now, can you help our listeners understand what is this feeling? What does it look like, sound like, feel like?
More than anything, the shame of having to tell the people around me that because most of the time, nobody knew I had started drinking again. Um, and I'm sure even if they had their suspicions, they wouldn't have imagined that in such a short period of time it had gotten to the point it had gotten to. I'm sure I didn't want to go back to treatment, but knew that told anyone, if I told my parents, it would be back to treatment. And if I told my friends, they would tell my parents,
Yeah.
which that is something that I've been so grateful for since this started a few years ago is I don't think I can't think of a single friend who would even hesitate for a second or who did hesitate for a second to call my parents.
Mm.
I don't think I can't name a single friend right now who doesn't have either one or both of my parents' numbers, and I think that's a blessing. I'm sure at the time it really pissed me off, but I think that is such a blessing to be surrounded by so many people who care enough about you to call your parents who, in most of their cases, they've never met, to get into my phone, get their number, and be willing to call and say she needs help again and she's not listening to me and you need to come.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
Well, just the idea of when I'm in, when I'm so intoxicated, being able to make the decision to get myself to the hospital. Because when you're that intoxicated, it's not that hard to make the decision to do anything. Everything sounds like a great idea. But then as the alcohol starts wearing off and you combine, first of all, the anxiety of realizing you have to tell everyone what's happened again with the physical anxiety that just naturally comes with alcohol wearing off and going through alcohol withdrawal, it just felt impossible. It didn't matter how badly I knew I needed to go back to treatment. It didn't matter how rational one half of my brain could be about the situation, the other half of my brain would just completely override it and be like, we don't have to do that. We'll do this tomorrow. We'll do this next week. It doesn't matter when we do this, but we're not doing it today.
Mhm. Exactly. So that's so important for people who are thinking about, they know they have a problem. I think that what Susanna just said is so important that if you're like, okay, well, I will quit tomorrow. I have to quit tomorrow. But for tonight or today, and I remember sharing with you at some point, sometimes you don't get that next day,
Right.
and that's the story I've also heard over and over again in the rooms is that we always think we have one more life in us. And as you had you've been to treatment 5 times. Is that fair? I don't remember.
Inpatient treatment 6 times.
6 times. And the body, picks up right where it left off when we go back to it. So the disease is still there even when we're not drinking. And it's very powerful. And that thought is that I keep in my own mind, and what I love to do to remind people that are in recovery is you think you're going to come back from it. You believe that you're going to come back for it because you can't quit today. You'll quit tomorrow. Just remember, there's not always a tomorrow for people, and you've had experience with that too.
Right.
Yeah. So why did the sixth time work? Tell us about what it was about the last time that something happened. What was the something that happened?
I had made a series of really poor choices, believe it or not, leading up to that final trip to inpatient treatment. My, I don't, some, this is another part that I include pretty much every time I tell my stories that every single time I hit rock bottom, or what I considered my rock bottom, I truly didn't think I could go any lower, whether that be financially, with my friendships, with my family members, with my career, with my education. I would keep getting to a new rock bottom and think there is no way it could get any worse than this. And then treatment would happen, sobriety would happen, a relapse would happen, and then I would find out that I most definitely could get to a worse place. And after I arrived at my last treatment center, I had some time to sober up and reflect on the current state of my life. And that was kind of hard to do considering I couldn't remember most of the few weeks leading up to that. But I knew the basic, I knew the summary. I had been informed of like the basics of what was going on in my life. And it just I kind of had this moment where it clicked, where I was sitting there thinking about what everything, meaning myself, my life, my everything had looked like the past 5 times I'd gotten to treatment, and how every single time I thought that was the worst it could possibly get. Sitting there, knowing what I knew about my life, I kind of realized like I need to stop saying that it cannot get worse because it can get worse. And I can either keep leaving here and keep showing myself how things can get worse, or I can just, something has got to change. I have to, up until that point, I had been rejecting every form of recovery once leaving treatment. I didn't want to go to meetings. I didn't want to be involved in any sort of community. I didn't want to listen to what anyone was telling me. I didn't want to leave the current home environment that I was in, that quite literally every single person who knew and loved me was telling me I needed to leave. I wanted to do it my way. And I figured if you guys don't want me to drink, then I just won't drink, but I'm not doing any of this other shit. And then I got to that treatment center. It was October of 2024. And I was just more scared than I'd gone lower than I ever possibly had imagined. My original rock bottom from 2 years prior was looking pretty fucking good. And that scared me. It scared me that if I tested the waters again to see if there was an even deeper rock bottom, that I wouldn't survive it, because I still to this day am not sure how I survived the bottoms before that one. And I felt deflated and defeated and scared and shameful in a way I never had before. I wasn't using any of the phone calls offered to me, which I think is, in an odd way, one of the most telling factors, because every other time I'd gotten to treatment, regardless of what I was feeling or how ashamed I was, I all I wanted to do was talk to my parents. And this time I'd gotten there and I had no desire to, not because I didn't miss them, not because I didn't want to hear their voice, but because there was no way I could face what was on the other end of the phone. And that was, I'm not sure why that ended up being the thing that got to me, but that was what ended up making me really sit there alone with my thoughts and consider that I was allowed to get back out and do this all over again. Nobody was going to physically stop me, but there was a really, really, really good chance that I wasn't going to survive it if I kept playing with fire, because that's what I was doing every time I chose to drink.
Mm, mm. And so when you finally had this awareness and as you said, you were not going to drink anymore, but you weren't going to go to any of those meetings and you weren't going to leave your apartment and all the things you mentioned. What changed that? Was it this awareness that came through you, or what was it that helped you then decide? Because you are doing the work now. So I'd love to hear and have our listeners hear about what changed things for you in that way.
I think it really just all comes down to the fear. I was, I've always, my entire life, been so stubborn. And even when I can admit, like, okay, maybe you're kind of right, I'll admit you're kind of right, but I'm still going to figure the rest out for myself.
Yeah.
And that's what I had been doing with my sobriety. And I was just so scared, scared in every possible way when I got to that last round of treatment, that, I mean, I still didn't want to leave my house. I still didn't want to go to meetings. I'm not in any way implying that all of a sudden I just wanted to do all these things that I'd been told to do. Leaving that house was definitely one of the hardest days of my life. I was attached to that. I didn't know you could be attached to a house the way I was. And I just was so full of every type of fear for my life, for my relationships, more than anything for my life, that I became just willing enough, not entirely willing, but just willing enough to consider the fact that, as ridiculous as it sounds, I might not be the best person to be making the decisions. And so, yeah, I really did just give in once and for all. I wasn't happy about it. I wasn't excited for this new recovery centered chapter of my life. But another thing that I'm really grateful for, that I will never forget, is the fact after the number of trips I took to this one specific treatment center, the staff there obviously knew me pretty well. And there is one nurse. He was the night nurse, and I called him Twilight because he looked like the guy from Twilight. And he's one of the funniest people I've ever interacted with. And I always loved when he was working, because everyone had a great time with him. But I had gone to the hospital before going to Bright Life that time, and he had he had a copy of my medical records and my blood work specifically from that trip to the hospital. And the first sober night I spent there, he um I went in to get my meds and he waited until everybody had cleared out of the room and he locked the door and he sat down across from me and he told me how scared he was from seeing my blood work and my labs and all my panels that the hospital had ran. I don't remember exactly what he said, and I wish I do, but he just basically said, "You keep you keep coming in here, you look worse every time." And then while holding the records just said, "I don't know how you survived this. I don't know how you've survived any of this, but this especially what I'm holding right here, I don't understand how you're sitting here in front of me,
Wow.
talking to me alive." And I give him a lot of credit for finally being one of the things that got through to me.
Hmm.
And because, I mean, at this point, I'm a extremely cynical person. I've a bad attitude when I'm not happy with myself, and I'm extremely cynical. And you know, probably up until this point would have written off Bright Life nurses or would have written off nurses at the treatment center as people who are just paid, just doing their job that they're paid to do. And something about his demeanor and the look in his eyes and the way he was speaking to me, he truly was so genuinely, on one hand, scared for me, and on the other hand, confused as to how I had just once again survived what I was putting my body through with alcohol. And that was part of what really got me to wake up and realize that just because I have survived these past incidents with alcohol does not mean I'm going to continue to survive them. The next one could be the last, and you wouldn't have believed it from seeing what I put my body through, but every part of me was afraid of dying. And I believe in a way, kind of had this reverse effect on myself where instead of becoming more and more scared with every relapse, I was, whether or not it was consciously or subconsciously, beginning to feel more invincible. And
Hmm.
I needed a wake up call to realize that I was not, every relapse was not making me stronger, which is what it honestly kind of seems like I believed. Every relapse was bringing me closer and closer to death. And if I didn't do something different, that is exactly what was going to happen.
So what your this story is so beautiful, really. The Do you call him Twilight?
Twilight, yes.
Twilight. So what Twilight did was not to shame you, judge you, leave you alone because he was disgusted with your behavior and how many times you had been there. He connected with you. He could
Right.
truly, you were seen, you were heard, and you were valued by him. And I want our listeners to understand that if you love an addict, shaming them, blaming them, punishing them, it may feel like the only thing to do because you've tried so many other things, but that is not what helps people get sober or stay sober. It's the connection that you felt with that person, another human being slowing down enough to say to you, man, I'm really scared. I look at these labs and it's not good.
Yeah.
And it's that moment of grace, I believe, that happens. At least I feel like I had a moment of grace, and I want our listeners, if you're suffering with addiction or you love someone in addiction, praying for willingness, praying for a moment of grace, and really staying connected to that person without shame is one path to helping people. And while we could go on forever, Suzanna, and I love to talk to each other. I have to say, she's one of the funniest people I have ever met. I know that she has so many talents, but I always tell her stand-up comedy is calling you. Like you couldn't hear it today, but I promise you, you won't meet anybody funnier. So I'd like to invite you back for part two, where you get to tell the after, because
Yeah.
you've told the pain, the journey there, how you got here. And then when the sixth time happened and Twilight was there, and you made this decision to commit, whether you probably were just so scared, and I'm imagining that you didn't know it would work, but you were willing. Does that sound appropriate? Does
Right.
that sound right? And then the rest of the story is so powerful. Susanna is doing all kinds of things right now that I want our listeners to hear, because there's this what happened, where we are now, and then what happens after, where we share experience, strength, and hope. And so our next episode with Susanna is going to be about her experience that she shared, but her strength and her hope. And we want everyone to have hope. If you're suffering with this disease, Susanna and I know it intimately, and I wish it on no one, but there is a way. There is a way out. And that's where we'd like to go on our next episode. Does that sound good to you, Susanna? Yeah.
Yeah.
I thank you for being with us today and appreciate your vulnerability. And these are the stories that you hear when you go into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. You hear the stories of people who have suffered, but you also get to hear what happens afterwards. And that is just powerful. It is so powerful to hear about recovery. And we want to leave you today with just an invitation to come back and learn more about Susanna's journey, that she has unlocked her power of connection, and with that has a blueprint for how to live her life now, because that's what recovery teaches us. Not only that we stop drinking, that's the beginning, but how do we live this life sober? And what resources do we bring along the way? And I'm really excited about our next episode. So we'll see you then the next time on The Blueprint. Thanks, everybody.